Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's going to be slightly schizophrenic evening for Derek at this time. Not quite sure where to stand or sit. Anyway, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Derek Williams, who is on the associated staff of the University of Edinburgh as a lecturer and tutor in music. He has had a lifelong interest in the works of Richard Wagner and was influenced by Wagner's works and construction of his own opera, Wild. He's responsible for running Edinburgh University's Wagner Week earlier this year, which I understand was a great success.
Yes, well, we'd like more people, of course.
Yes, well, yes. We can talk about that, yes. He's very much a Renaissance man. He's an educator. He's been self-employed variously as composer, including, I discovered, an Oscar for Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, which I don't know whether Wagner influenced that or not, but he's a conductor, musical director, record producer for a range of international clients, and has performed in the pit in Cats for 400 performances, and also Phantom of the Opera. But he's here tonight to talk to us about Wagner and the Third Reich.
Well, it's an intimidating audience to stand in front of, because I know you've had some extraordinary speakers here from first-hand experience, so they're very hard act to follow, so I'll do my best. The topic of the Third Reich, I understand, has not been covered here before, so maybe it's the elephant in the room, talking about antisemitism, prejudice, the war, and people don't want to talk about the war. But I'm going to talk about it just one more time. Maybe this will be the last time. Maybe we'll resolve Wagner's anti-Semitism with his friendship with so many Jewish people, and whether he had any seminal influence on the Third Reich. Now, to pursue this, there's the handsome chap up there. To pursue this, I looked at it from the point of view of philosophers, that all these people knew. Wagner knew Nietzsche, for example, had a friendship with Nietzsche. It's quite incestuous, actually. It's incestuous. Let's go back a step and have a look at some of the influences of these people on each other. Luther, I put in there for a very good reason, you'll find out in a moment. Descartes, Kant, Schopenhauer, Wagner and Hitler. I put them both in yellow, by the way, so you can see the connection. Freud, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein and Heidegger. The interesting thing about those, well, three of them are born in the same year. For example, Wittgenstein, Hitler and Heidegger, all born in 1889. In fact, Wittgenstein, who was a Jewish philosopher, spent most of his life in Cambridge, went to school with Hitler in the same class. But Wittgenstein went to a class up, Hitler was kept back a year, so it's unlikely that they had much to do with each other. But had they had much to do with each other, it's probable that Hitler would have thought Wittgenstein was a Jew and therefore not to be tolerated, and Wittgenstein probably would have taken no notice of Hitler, but if he had, he would have thought him as a boor and a bore. But to school they went together. Now, the only philosopher that you could, philosophers plural, that you could attribute anti-Semitism to would be, in that group, would be Luther and Heidegger, who was also a contemporary of Hitler. The thing about Hitler and Nietzsche, though, it's interesting that he holds Nietzsche in high esteem, despite Nietzsche having never written anything particularly anti-Semitic. In fact, to the contrary, as you'll find out when I get into the nitty-gritty. Heidegger, on the other hand, signed up for the whole package of Nazi Germany. So, long before Richard Wagner emerged as a political and theatrical figure, around the time of Bismarck's 1871 German unification, which gave full citizenship to Germany's Jewish minority, anti-Semitism was already established, ubiquitous and entrenched. Martin Luther, in his, let's show you a picture of Martin Luther, in case you've forgotten what he looks like. Martin Luther, in his 1543 treatise on Jews and their lies, in case you were wondering what it was about, had urged that rabbis be forbidden to preach, their prayer books destroyed, Jewish synagogues and homes set afire, and that the Jews' money and property should be confiscated. They should be shown neither kindness nor mercy, nor should they be afforded legal protection. Luther wrote that these poisonous envenomed worms, so it's an interesting word to use since the time where the treatise was posted was in fact worms, should be either permanently expelled or drafted into forced labour. When he wrote, "We are at fault in not slaying them," however, Luther was moving into advocating genocide. So as far back as the 16th century, you're seeing a call to eradicate the Jewish people. Earlier in his career, Luther had been sympathetic to Jewish Renaissance, Jewish resistance to Catholicism, but he did expect Jews to convert to his reconstructed Christianity. When they would not, he turned completely against them. And you'll find this turning against Jews as ubiquitous throughout history. Hitler didn't mind Jews in his adolescence, nor did Wagner very much. But something happened to turn them against them, and we're going to look at why that happened today. Against this iniquitous background, Wagner's anti-Semitism is comprehensively set, not only in contemporary literature, but by himself in his twice-published treatise Das Judentum in der Musik. Here's a photo of Das Judentum in der Musik. Judaism in Music is the translation. Alongside other writings and personal correspondence. Nevertheless, prominent Jews numbered amongst Wagner's closest friends. For example, his favourite conductor, Hermann Levi, who conducted Parsifal, Wagner's Paean to Christianity, and who was invited to be a pallbearer at the master's funeral. Let's have a look at Levi. Oh, that's not Levi. That's Levi. Looks quite unprepossessing. You wouldn't think of necessarily gassing him, I would have thought. But anyway, there he is. In light of his toxic and verbose animus towards all things Jewish, what sort of intimate conversations would Richard Wagner possibly have expected to have been able to have with Jews in his circle of friends? And what sort of discourse might he have enjoyed with the likes of his great admirer, Adolf Hitler? Would Wagner have approved of the Third Reich and all that it connoted? I showed you Hitler before. When it comes to heated dinner discussions, there are a few topics, indeed, that can compete with a jolly Reich over the alleged posthumous responsibility of preening Richard Geyer, you know who he was, Wagner, for the Third Reich, of the preening Adolf Schicklgruber. Do you know who he was? Hitler. They seem to go in for second marriages. There's an ample justification for this. In Das Judentum, Wagner excoriates Jews. Here are a few examples. He talks about their appearance as being as exciting involuntary repellence. He's outraged that their emancipation is accepted by liberals. Even then they had liberals. The nature and personality of Jews, money, the influence on modern art, religion, they have God all to themselves, he complained. The speech, learned German, not the Muttersprache of his own people. Music related to speech, devoid of human feeling. No sculptors or architects and no culturally identifiable art. These are all his accusations in Das Judentum in der Musik. Usury, money without effort. You can make money, you don't have to work. Thinkers, backward-looking poets, whereas he saw the poet as being a foretelling prophet. Mendelssohn compared to Bach, Mozart, Beethoven in terms of speech. His allusion to Meyerbeer, but not explicit statement of Meyerbeer, as creating thrilling situations, emotional catastrophes, and Mendelssohn's art renown rather than artist. Utterly unartistic claims, mindless, feelingless, routine, no organic life. And in his opinion, there were no Jewish poets. And he said, from out his isolation as a Jew, born came amongst us seeking redemption. He found it not, and had to learn that only with our redemption, too, into genuine manhood would he ever find it. To become man at once with us, however, means firstly, for the Jew, as much as ceasing to be a Jew. And it's no secret that Wagner tried to convert all his Jewish friends to Christianity. It's also well known that he failed to succeed in most of those cases. Now, in 2004, recognise that gentleman? Another Jewish conductor, contemporary. Guided by satellite navigation, I drove all the way across the middle of Australia to see for the first time a full production of Der Ring des Nibelungen, conducted by the Jewish conductor Asher Fish. It was performed in 3 consecutive seasons of 4 nights apiece at the Adelaide Festival Theatre, as part of my first and perhaps last reconnoitre across the Australian desert. I'd longed to experience being surrounded by absolutely nothing at all, to relive vicariously the sensation of recounted by my paternal grandfather during his military service in World War I in Egypt. It was just me, Wagner, the Ring, and 10,000 desert flies who found me from nowhere when I got out of the car to experience the wilderness. My expedition included catching up with my Scottish first cousin in Adelaide, and I well recall being unable to persuade Isabel to join me at the Ring because of Wagner's association with "he whose name shall not be mentioned," and his name was never mentioned in the conversation. My long pilgrimage to her front doorstep notwithstanding, this hit remarkably close to home because at the start of the war, my great-grandparents' family in Scotland had decided to change the name by deed poll from Marks to Bowman. My family name originally was Marks, with a KS, as there were justifiable fears the Nazis would prevail in Europe. This zeitgeist had its parallel on other sides of the Channel. I once had occasion to remark to an Austrian friend, surely Germans must have been aware of what was going on in the concentration camps, practically under their noses. Didn't the employees whose job it was to shovel Jewish corpses into the ovens have homes to go to? Her answer shot back practically before I had finished the question. Well, she said, it was like this. If you disagreed with the regime, you were shot. The finality of her answer silenced me at the time, but I wondered, was this really the ennobling world that Wagner had envisaged when he composed Die Meistersinger, Parsifal, Der Ring des Nibelungen? I didn't want to think so, but given that so many do think so, I decided to do an investigation of my own. There is a view that the profligacy of Nazi evil should not be memorialised in any way at all that might bestow justification upon the purveyor thereof. For example, experiments conducted by Joseph Goebbels to see how long it took to freeze a healthy person to death in a vat of icy water. Should data obtained by such dreadful means be used, ever? When we listen to Wagner and send our money to Bayreuth, are we comparably guilty of tacit endorsement? I argue that the use, however, in peacetime of data obtained even under such duress is the only good outcome of this depraved regime, posthumously honouring lives otherwise meaninglessly terminated. Moreover, I ask, would Richard Wagner, surrounded as he was by Jewish friends and admirers, really have been interested in finding out how long it might take to freeze to death a Jew, a gypsy, a communist, or a homosexual, as the Nazis did? Without question, he was Europe's most notorious anti-Semite, published twice on the subject, but many times again in other journals. But what sort of conversation might he be expected to have had about such an idea with his closest friend Herman Levi, for example, the Jewish conductor who premiered Parsifal, albeit not his first choice? Herman, my dearest friend and esteemed conductor of my operas, I admit to wondering lately how long it might take to freeze you to death in a vat of icy water. It hardly seems imaginable, let alone likely. In the Wagner Journal Online, on the other hand, Mark Berry argues that Wagner's anti-Semitism doesn't have to be so much impinging on his music dramas as it is intrinsic to them. That would suggest that his works don't have to have a de facto anti-Semitic message in their expositions. Rather, he argues, Wagner's anti-Semitism could be argued as inherent to the nature of his ennobling treatise of German nation, race and culture. If so, we might begin to understand how racism in general and Jew-baiting, and Jew-hating in particular, were for him sine qua non. But like Shakespeare, the dialectic nature of Wagner's thought is that he works by process of contradiction. Apart from Kundry and Parsifal, there is no explicitly Jewish character in his entire catalogue. None of Wagner's operas carries clearly identified anti-Semitic characters or ideas like those of Dickens, Dostoevsky, Mussorgsky, or the dreadful Jewish characters in Oscar Wilde's Salome. Even if Alberic really were intended as a Jewish stereotype, which is explicitly contradicted by Wagner himself in his libretto, as the eventual loser, the Nibelung dwarf can be viewed as in a sympathetic light, just as Charlotte can be viewed in a sympathetic light in The Merchant of Venice, and Judas in Jesus Christ Superstar. All these dark characters are ultimately redemptive, ipso facto. Wagner was at pains to point this out during a heated argument he had with Gobineau about Parsifal, and I'll refer to that later. Perhaps the only way to understand this is to accept that while Wagner had prejudice against the Jews, he had deep fondness for particular Jews. Some of my best friends are Jews actually rings true for Wagner. It may also, however, be that both Richard and Cosima could have been trying to distance themselves from perceived Jewish or part Jewish ancestry. Modern-day analogies abound of anti-gay activists turning out to be closeted homosexuals themselves, mostly evangelicals and Republican politicians. No smoke without fire. Alexander Knapp, lecturer in Jewish music at London University, points out Wagner was not the only composer to show antagonism towards Jews. Chopin, Liszt, Mussorgsky are also on record as having made comments that could be regarded as anti-Semitic. In fact, it was not unusual in the 19th century. 19th century was commonplace for left-wing revolutionaries, Marx among them, to be hostile to the Jews whom they held responsible for propping up bourgeois capitalism. Alongside a handful of contemporary Jewish performers of his music, Wagner's Jewish friends included Julie Schwab, Joseph Rubinstein, Bertold Auerbach, Heinrich Porges, Karl Tausig, and Hermann Levi. Levi was the son of a Rabbi Benedict Levi, and clearly as Jewish as they come. For a while, he had also been a friend of Brahms. More of that shortly. And here's a nice photo of Brahms. No, there isn't. There it is. The other one was the ring. He was a friend of Brahms until a breach occurred in 1875 after Levi said that Wagner was better than Gluck, despite Brahms freely admiring much of Wagner's output, even tolerating directors of his works. Levi had acknowledged that as a musician, Brahms was superior to Wagner, but when it came to putting music into the service of drama, no one could equal the force of Richard Wagner. In the end, and to their mutual distress, Levi chose Wagner over Brahms, and friendship terminated. As early on as 1850, while Wagner's then wife Minna was complaining that he slandered whole races who had been helpful to him, nice picture of Minna, Wagner was busy befriending a bevy of loyal Jews, the wealthy merchant Axelfeld and the philologist Samuel Leers, both of whom feature in his autobiography. Years later, upon learning of Leers' death, Wagner was so distraught that he could not speak for over a week. He described relationship with Leers as one of the most beautiful of his life. Two Vienna Jews who became enveloped by the friendship of Wagner were Karl Tausig and Heinrich Porges. There's Porges and there's Tausig. They're perfectly harmless. Porges was born in Prague and originally studied philosophy and law there, later turning to music. Go back to him. In 1863, he became an assistant of the critic Franz Brendel and became a devotee and intimate of Richard Wagner. Porges has extensive notes on Wagner's rehearsal and staging were published in the journal Bayreuther Blätter over the period 1880 to 1896. In 1862, he organized a subscription concert for Wagner to be conducted by Wagner himself in Prague. Wagner was astonished to find the majority of the front row seats were populated by Jews, and even more surprised that his success in that city was down to the Jewish population. Porges' study of Tristan and Isolde was published after his death in 1906 by Hans von Wolfshagen. He had received a life pension from King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Tausig, whom Wagner affectionately called his little devil of a fellow, when aged only 19, was born in Warsaw to Jewish parents and received his first piano lessons from his father, who introduced him to Franz Liszt in Weimar at the age of 14. He quickly became a favourite pupil of Liszt, travelling with him on concert tours and studying counterpoint, composition and orchestration in addition to his piano lessons. At the age of 16, he met Richard Wagner, of whom he became a devoted follower and friend. He also became a great admirer and friend of Johannes Brahms. How did that work out, you might well wonder. Tausig made piano arrangements in many of Wagner's operas. He also introduced to Wagner his friend Peter Cornelius, another Wagner devotee. Despite the republication of Das Judentum in der Musik under Wagner's real name this time, the first time he published under Freigedanke, free thinking. After Julie Schwab, a Jewish businesswoman and philanthropist, had donated Wagner money in Paris on the recommendation of her friend Marie Mukhanov, he wrote to her of his thoughts. This is Wagner writing about the Jews in the same period, by the way. The great talents of heart and mind from the circle of Jewish society whom I have learned to know and truly to enjoy. Certainly I am of the opinion that everything which oppresses the genuine German character from that side burdens in an even more terrible measure the witty and sensitive Jews themselves. If the Jewish element is to become assimilated with us, it is clear that not concealment of the difficulties, but only the open exposure of them can further it. It's a slightly different way of looking at anti-Semitism to simply hating and killing people you've never met. Despite his assertions that they were lightweights, Jews nevertheless populated the Wagner inner sanctum and included the Jewish tenor Einkelor Neumann. There he is. Neumann decided to give up singing for opera management and directing. He thought so highly of Wagner's operas that he wanted to promote them all over Europe, a huge undertaking at a time when many considered the mere idea to be ridiculous. Neumann succeeded, and although they did have a brief falling out, their relationship endured until Wagner's death. Likewise, the Jewish soprano Lily Lehmann sang at the first Bayreuth Festival in 1876, appointed by none other than Wagner himself. She was cast in the roles of Vogelinde and Helmige by Wagner. Ironically, despite going on to become one of the greatest Wagnerians of all time, the anti-Semitism of the Green Hill during Cosima Wagner's tenure prevented Bayreuth audiences from hearing her definitive Brunhilde and many other great roles. When Mark Weiner, a German studies professor at Indiana University and author of Richard Wagner and the Anti-Semitic Imagination, started reading about Wagner's paranoid, self-aggrandizing delusions of racial purity, he still concluded there is no connection between Wagner and Hitler's National Socialism, notwithstanding the obvious conflation. Still, the issue remains an open matter because Hitler is on the record as having said, whoever wants to understand National Socialism must know Wagner. Grandiose statement, one of many. This begs the question of how well Hitler really knew his proclaimed idols, Wagner, Nietzsche, Heidegger and Schopenhauer. Any of these philosophers worth his salt would be aware of logical fallacies, perhaps the most well-known of which is argumentum ad hominem, arguing against the person. How could you possibly know anything about music? You're a Jew. You don't even meet the person, but you make up your mind about someone before you met them. It's a logical fallacy. And Hitler specialized in this, argumentum ad antiquatem. We do this because it's always been done that way, not because it's the right thing to do. Argumentum ad baculum, appeal to force. We do this because we're bigger than you. Argumentum ad ignorantiam. I'm right because you can't prove me wrong. It's like the proof of God. God is here because you can't prove he's not there. That doesn't match Pascal's wager for a proof, I have to say, but that's an example of a logical fallacy. Argumentum ad misericordiam, appealing to people's misery as a way of making something true. Argumentum ad populum, something's right because everyone thinks it's right. Hitler was voted into power, therefore he must be right. Argumentum ad verecundiam, this is Hitler's specialization. Nietzsche said something, therefore it's right. Well, if Nietzsche's talking about philosophy, that's fine. But if Madonna says E equals MC squared, does that give more cogency to E equals MC squared? Not as much as if Einstein says it. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Something happened after something else, therefore it's caused by the thing that happened before. I turned the tap on, the sun rose, therefore turning the tap on caused the sun to rise. Obviously a logical fallacy. So all these logical fallacies, if you have them in your mind when you read Hitler, you read Mein Kampf, you can see through it all. The conductor Leon Botstein said that he believed genocide was never part of Wagner's anti-Semitism, as for example, it had been part of Martin Luther's 4 centuries before. Wagner just wanted the Jews to go away. There's nothing to suggest even remotely he intended to accomplish this by wiping them all out. Enjoying his work doesn't mean that we agreed with his views. Wagner was a far greater dramatist and composer than he was a racist. Wagner said that even characters who might be perceived as carrying the marks of anti-Semitism in the ring are actually the most compelling, as I mentioned before. The dark characters are redemptive, and they actually win you over. When you think about Shylock and how he was the bad guy in Merchant of Venice, he actually makes you think about anti-Semitism. You think, am I not, do I not bleed? Despite having wanted this pound of flesh, by casting with the bad character, it's a bit like the dualism, the duality in Julius Caesar, where the whole crowd is cheering on Brutus and baying for the blood of Mark Antony. He gets up there and has a chat, and 5 minutes later they're all baying for the blood of Brutus, and they're on Antony's side. But he has this, they're all honourable men, mantra that goes on and on and on. So by representing a bad character that everyone agrees is bad, and saying, we're agreeing, we're on the same page. You can then say, we're agreeing about this. Now we have some more things. What about that? You can win people over once you're on the same page. As I learned from many years of teaching, being a bully doesn't win people over. so well. Hagen, Alberich, and to a lesser extent Mima are actually very moving human characters. Wagner said that's because Wagner conceives of them from their point of view. Especially the opening of Siegfried. You remember that Mima's hacking away and you see that he's just so badly treated by Siegfried. You feel sorry for him. Well, if you're going to cast him as a Jewish stereotype, you could argue that is that Wagner, using the duality of the situation to create a sympathetic role for a Jewish character, he might be relying on pervasive antisemitism of the day and thinking, well, how can I win these people over? Who knows? Let's press on though. Citing an essay by the Jewish German philosopher Theodor Adorno, In Search of Wagner, Wagner said that Wagner might have, with horror, recognized himself in Mima. So he omitted a lot of the original descriptions of him, the small stature, the constant whining, and the avarice. His hatred is stronger with Mima, which is one reason why he's a less successful character than perhaps Ulrich is. It would be irresponsible to look at Wagner without thinking about Hitler in the background, Wagner continued, but that doesn't mean we should anchor ourselves to that. There's so much more we can acknowledge and pursue in Wagner that we don't need to hammer people over the head with and say, no, don't enjoy it too much because Hitler really loved him. If that were the case, then if you say, well, having Hitler as a fan is bad for your career, well, it's not very good for vegetarians either. One standpoint from which to investigate Hitler's appropriation of Wagner is through the lineage of philosophy, Nietzsche in particular. Once a close friend of Wagner and admired by Hitler to the point of his sending roses to Mrs. Nietzsche upon her husband's death. In our inquiry into the possibility they harboured a shared anti-Semitism, we do well to consider also Kant, Luther, Darwin, Tolstoy, Descartes, Marx, Freud, Socrates, Schopenhauer, Wittgenstein, Aristotle, Plato, Bertrand Russell, Leibniz, and Heidegger. That's a lineage. All of these people knew the people before, and they based their philosophy upon them. We'll come to the idea of the prevalence of the forced will as the forced power, which come across in the film in a moment. What connects all these? They're all men. Were they all anti-Semites? Well, not unless Wittgenstein is a self-hating Jew. Did they believe in racial purity of Übermensch and an innate inferiority of the corresponding Untermensch? Well, Übermensch was the central point of Nietzsche's thesis. Wagner had been greatly impressed with his reading of Schopenhauer in 1854, and this greatly affected his thoughts and practice on music and art. There's the young Schopenhauer. He aged well, didn't he? Writers such as Brian McGee see Parsifal as Wagner's last great espousal of Schopenhauerian philosophy. Parsifal can heal Amfortas and redeem country because he shows compassion, which Schopenhauer saw as the highest form of human morality. The only compassion you could say that Hitler would have had would be for Eva Braun and dogs. So compassion can be there in paradoxical ways, the likes of the Führer. Schopenhauerian philosophy also suggests that the only escape from the ever-present temptations of human life is through the negation of the will, of the force of it, a concept that preoccupied Nietzsche. The World as Willed and Representation is the most famous book. There's a number of points made by Schopenhauer, and I'll run through these quickly so you can think of them in the light of the opposite of Wagner and the like of Wagner. He said, honour has not to be won, it must only not be lost. After your death, you will be what you were before your death. After your death, you will be what you were before your birth. Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. Life is short and truth works far and lives long. Let us speak the truth. We forfeit 3/4 of our lives in order to be like other people. Change along is eternal, perpetual, immortal. Every parting gives a foretaste of death. Every reunion a hint of resurrection. Only loss teaches the value of things. When you think about the joy you have at the acquisition of something, how long does that joy last? You get a new car. You're polishing it, opening the door, and smell of new leather. Fantastic. A few days, maybe. If your car is stolen, is that a few days? Months. The pain of loss is 10 times the intensity of the joy of acquisition. So only loss, says Schopenhauer, before the days of cars, teaches the value of things. To overcome the difficulties is to experience the full delight of existence. In fact, the loss of a relationship, how much more painful is that than the joy of acquiring it, as great as that is? Each day is like a little life, every waking and rising a little birth, every fresh morning a little youth, every going to rest and sleep a little death. The person who writes for fools is always sure of a large audience. Arthur Schopenhauer was deeply influenced by Buddhist thought and is in many ways the West's answer to it. He too tells us to rein in our desires and adopt a consolingly pessimistic Buddhist attitude to our struggles. Despite all his chest beating, however, Hitler didn't understand Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, nor even Wagner, at an even superficial level. Jacob Gollon observed Nietzsche's ideas were widely disseminated among and appropriated by the first Hebrew Zionist writers and leaders. According to Stephen Ushheim, classical Zionism, that essentially secular and modernizing movement, was acutely aware of the crisis of Jewish tradition and supporting institutions. Nietzsche was enlisted as an authority for articulating the movement's ruptured relationship with the past and a force in its drive to normalization and activist ideal for self-creating Hebraic new man. We see this ambivalent attitude in an early work, Human All Too Human. In a brief discussion of the problem of the Jews, Nietzsche shows evident sympathy for their suffering. I would like to know how much one must excuse in the overall accounting of a people which, not without guilt on our parts, has had the most sorrowful history of all peoples. In a brief moment of praise, and in noted contrast to later writings, he hails the contributions of the Jews. They are the ones to whom we owe the noblest human being, Christ, the purest philosopher, Spinoza, the mightiest book, and the most effective moral code in the world. This would be virtually his last unconditional praise for Jesus and the Bible. He is famous for having said that God is dead, as you're probably aware. Nietzsche's next book, Daybreak, offers conditional praise for the Jews based on their long history of exclusion, isolation, and persecution. After Daybreak, there was a long 5-year stretch in which Nietzsche did not address the Jewish problem in any substantial way. The Gay Science focused instead on the nature of science, on power and the death of God. His other book of this period, famous Thus Spake Zarathustra, famously set to music by Richard Strauss, contained no reference to it. But by 1886, with the release of Beyond Good and Evil, he had returned to the topic. Again, his language is mixed. He praises the Old Testament. In the Jewish Old Testament, the Book of the Divine Justice, he says that there are human beings, things and speeches in so grand a style that Greek and Indian literature have nothing to compare with it. Europeans are furthermore indebted to the Jews for their high conception of ethics. What Europe owes to the Jews? Many things, good and bad, and above all, one thing that is the best and the worst, the grand style of morality, the terribleness and majesty of infinite demands, infinite meanings. The Will to Power, Nietzsche wrote an important 5th chapter of his earlier books and published one of his greatest works on the genealogy of morals. Part 5 of Gay Science includes 2 relevant entries. First is a laudatory passage on the Jewish love of logic and analysis. All of the Jewish scholars have a high regard for logic, that is, for compelling agreement by force of reasons. But nothing is more democratic than this logic. This has been a real benefit to us all. Europe owes the Jews no small thanks for making people think more logically and for establishing cleaner intellectual habits. When discussing their cultural influence, their presence in stage, theatre and press, Nietzsche offers the following thoughts. As for the Jews, the people who possess the art of adaptability par excellence, suggests immediately that one might see them virtually as a world historical arrangement for the production of actors, a veritable breeding ground for actors. And really, is it time to ask what good actor is there today who is not a Jew? Jew is a born literate, a man of letters, as the true master of the European press, who exercises his power by virtue of his theatrical gifts. For the man of letters is essentially an actor. He plays the expert, specialist. By now, you might be forgiven for wondering whether Hitler actually ever read Nietzsche. However, in Genealogy, Nietzsche finally begins to write in more overtly racial tones, speaking of the blonde Aryan and the master race, or the conqueror race. But still, he lambastes those who do not see instructive value in the Jews. He said, I also do not like these latest speculators in idealism, the anti-Semites, who today roll their eyes in a Christian Aryan bourgeois manner and exhaust one's patience by trying to rouse up all the horned beast elements in people. But on the other hand, the Jews and their morality come in for severe criticism, not because of their ability to succeed, but because of what they inherently are. Nietzsche's overall view on Judaism and its Christian offshoot is nicely summarized in this passage from Genealogy. Let's bring this to a conclusion. The symbol of this battle, written in script which has remained legible throughout all human history up to the present, is called Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. In Rome, the Jew was considered guilty of hatred against the entire human race. And that view was correct to the extent we are right to think that the health and future of the human race is the unconditional rule of aristocratic values, the Roman values. By contrast, how did Jews feel about the Romans? We can guess that from 1,000 signs, but it is sufficient to treat ourselves again to the apocalypse of St. Paul, that wildest of all written outbursts which vengeance has on its conscience. The Romans were indeed strong and noble men, but by contrast the Jews were par excellence the priestly people who possessed an unparalleled genius for popular morality. Which of them has proved victorious for the time being, Rome or Judea? Just think of who it is that people bow down to today, not only in Rome, but almost in half the earth, in front of 3 Jews, as we know, and 1 Jewess, in front of Jesus and others, the fisherman Peter, the carpet maker Paul, and the mother of the first mentioned Jesus named Mary. That is very remarkable. Without doubt, Rome has been conquered. Selective use of individual sentences or fragments can paint Nietzsche either as a philo or anti-Semite, and both have been done, but surely not a single word of any of this writing permits the Holocaust of the Jews. Not then, not now, and not ever. When it comes to prejudice and all that it connotes, it seems to me that that appertaining issues need to be turned over, researched and talked about freely, no matter how unpleasant, in order truly to understand its quintessential nature and all that it connotes, if we are ever to understand and eradicate it permanently from the human condition. Aside from terrorist cabals, demographic minorities like gays and Jews are often portrayed as a threat to civilization as we know it, on the irrational basis that 5 to 10% of the population, or even 1%, can mount a tangible threat to the other 90 to 95%, whereas the opposite is far more likely to be the case. The minority clearly has far more to fear from the tyranny of the majority, a term coined in 1788 by President John Adams. Inequities pursuant gave rise to the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution adopted in 1868, otherwise known as equal protection, thereby recognizing the innate value of each and every citizen as equal before the law, irrespective of minority status. It could be argued that every individual is a minority of just one person, because there's no one quite like you and there's no one quite like me. A case in point was African Americans, who to this day number only 14% of the United States population, having their rights being determined by the other 86%. Without the protection afforded by the 14th Amendment, they had no legal standing unless whites condescended to give it to them. The representation of minorities as having the capability to bring about the end of days becomes more invidious still when it is attached to a religious motif, attributing to disliked minorities an unproven but nevertheless fearsome power to anger God to the point of flooding the earth, drowning the racists along with the non-racists, a sort of Götterdämmerung in reverse. The imperative to eliminate persecution and scapegoating of minorities has in modern times given rise to the International Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, the United States Civil Rights Act of 1964, and progressively over intervening years anti-discrimination ordinances in most first world countries, protecting innate qualities of gender, race, sexual orientation and left-handedness alongside physical and mental disability. As we know, every one of these was abused under the Third Reich of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party, most notoriously Germany's Jewish population. It could be said as a result that the thing that now most defines the secular Jew of the 21st century has become antisemitism. The case against Richard Wagner. It took the ascendancy of Hitler, the Third Reich, the concomitant Holocaust of the Jews to turn the anti-Semitism of the 19th century in general and of the composer Richard Wagner in hindsight, and in particular, into a burning contemporary issue. It now seems next to impossible to write about Wagner without at some point being confronted by his anti-Semitism. Indeed, Wagner is one of the most written about composers in history, with 10,000 texts already in publication by the time of his death. By 1930, that number had already trebled and likely now outnumbers in the hundreds of thousands. It is as important to evaluate the role that anti-Semitism played in the life of Richard Wagner as it is to evaluate the role that Wagner's anti-Semitism played in the emergence of the Third Reich and the Holocaust of the Jews. In his book, Richard Wagner and the Jews, Richard Milton. My Richards and Milton mixed up. Milton Brenner laments the fact that at that time his was the solitary tome on this issue. In Wagner's disdainful Das Judentum, the by then avowedly anti-Semitic artist emerges, attacking the hissing, shrill babble of the Jewish dialect, both in the synagogue and in quotidian expression, such as to suggest that Jews were somehow incapable of artistic manifestation because of their speech. It may well be that such perceived Jewish idiosyncratic speech formation was nothing more than their speaking German with a foreign accent. No difference, in essence, to how a German of today, struggling to speak Hebrew, might sound like if they were to go to Israel. Wagner likewise castigates Jews for their alleged dearth of sculptors, architects, and artists. Telling is the fact that the essay was originally published under a pseudonym, as Wagner apparently feared the publication might cause outrage. Indeed, the opening tone of the piece is a little apologetic. A pointlessly provocative re-release of the essay in 1868 caused a storm in the press, slating his contemporary critic, Edward Hanslick. This is Hanslick, yeah. Actually, no. Make these go bigger. He had this to say about Wagner in his piece Forbidden Music. The piece Forbidden Music by Michael Haas. This is Hanslick said, Richard Wagner has augmented his usual practice of self-glorification over the years with an increasingly industrious sideline and pamphleteering. Most recently, we have been treated to something called Judaism in music. Jews are apparently the most abhorrent beings of all creation, and a Jew happens to be anyone who doesn't like Richard Wagner and doesn't choose to worship at his shrine. Wagner sets forth with the accusation of enmity in the press, and not just in Germany, but also for us in England. Behind this finely woven web of animosity stands, according to Wagner, a cabal of Jewish intrigue, directed specifically against him. Ever since his tract Judaism and Music appeared in Leipzig, periodical in 1850, everyone who spurns the eating of ham and pork also spurns the works of Richard Wagner and never misses an opportunity to avenge themselves, according to Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner informs us that his tract was widely read and caused enormous offence, although, astonishingly enough, the essay was not published under his own name, but that of a certain Mr. Freethinker, Wagner. Of course, it fits Wagner's sense of self-importance that the entire culturist establishment, along with all its journalistic partners, carries around a grudge acquired from an anonymous article published some 19 years ago in Leipzig. I have to admit, I found myself only aware of Wagner's illustrious pamphlet of 1850 with the publication of the second one. Wagner further writes, said Hanslick, Leipzig has been musically baptized into Jewry, thanks to its long association with Mendelssohn. Leipzig is now the undisputed capital of Jew music. Yes, we have to do this. Oh, that's Hanslick. There's Mendelssohn. The brochure continues in this obnoxious and hateful manner. It was in the Jew capital of music that the plot that Wagner should henceforth be ignored was hatched. More than just ignored, he should be punished in all of his musical and literary efforts. After his attack on journalism, he moves rapidly, says Hanslick, to theatre directors. As he puts it, you have no doubt wondered why the rapid success of German theatres and my early works, these very same theatres have reacted with lazy indifference to my later ones. My works were popular before the start of the Jew agitation, and it was quite impossible to halt their success. Not every theatre in the land can match the Court Opera of Munich as a prenatal clinic for Richard Wagner's musical offspring. Wagner even allows his passions to lead him to the impertinent accusation that correspondence with directors of the court operas in Berlin and Vienna convinces him that not only was it their intention that the operas should not play in their own theatres, but they would do whatever they could to stop their performances anyway. Wagner finally stumbles over the name of Robert Schumann, about whom he has to say something hateful. Compare the two periods of Schumann's output, the one full of plastic creativity, the other flat bombast. What could the cause of this change be? Asked Hanslick. Could it be, as we have always assumed, the nervous disorder under which he tragically suffered and died? Oh, of course not. Wagner informs us the reason lies in the exposure of Schumann to Jews. If Wagner's pamphlet had until now seemed only ridiculous, it now seemed to be deeply repellent. With this, we slam shut this tiny booklet that will win the author few friends and most likely add appreciably to his Jewish enemies. Wagner's characteristics can be of only psychiatric interest. This most hopeless case of self-idolatry has reached such unimagined height that there is simply no oxygen left for normal brain function. One can only recall Wagner's Old Testament predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, who for so long believed himself to be a god that over time he turned into an ordinary ox eating grass, and eventually found himself turned into an opera by Verdi. Very entertaining critic was Hanslick. I'd hate to have been at his mercy, I must say. Wagner's fury at those whom he wrongly believed slighted him was magnified by the discovery that they had not done so, and only led to an increase in vehemence, a character trait observed by Cosima herself in her diary letters. For example, when recounting Wagner's giving the young Siegfried a good telling off for his infuriating innocence. There he is with his dad. That's a lovely photo, actually, I think. It shows a paternal softness to Wagner. You don't see in these other stern-looking images. Apparently he wasn't one for politeness either. Wagner disdained courtesy because he thought of it gave people the appearance of being slaves. This attitude revealed itself in his diary entry of 1878 with a comment about the French manner of being obliging to everybody, which he took to be nothing more or less than rank obsequiousness. This overbearing demeanour spills over into his pamphleteering and other literature and his professional relationships. It didn't particularly help Hanslick's anti-Wagner's anti-Semitism cause that the fact he and other critics were perceived as doing the ordinary man's thinking for him, as a consequence sent bigger than ever audiences after Wagner's work and increased prices. The critics really didn't harm Wagner at all. Before 1850, there was no evidence of Wagner avowing particularly anti-Semitic views. However, in the early days of his musical career, especially after his stay in Paris in 1840-41, he started to begrudge the success of Jewish composers, the likes of Meyerbeer and Mendelssohn, blaming them for his poverty and lack of success, and being reduced to merely copy editing. It happened that Wagner did have significant contact with Meyerbeer. It's Meyerbeer, who advanced him money and helped arrange for the 1842 Dresden premiere of his first successful opera, Rienzi. It must have irked Wagner still more that in order to climb the public ladder, he must emulate Meyerbeer, to the extent that his opera Rienzi was irreverently termed Meyerbeer's best opera by the German conductor, composer and pianist Hans von Bülow, who was Cosima Wagner's first husband. Meyerbeer himself later expressed bewilderment and hurt over Wagner's published abuse of him, his Jewish faith and his works. It was also manifestly unfair of Wagner to single out Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer when there would have been any number of vastly inferior contemporary composers who just didn't happen to be Jewish. Why give them a free pass? While ample evidence exists of a pervasive contemporary culture of anti-Semitism, the fact that Wagner suffered greatly for his trenchant criticisms of Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer, couched in both cases in entirely racist terminology, suggests that he couldn't necessarily count on popular anti-Semitic prejudice to bolster his calumny of Jews. Moreover, Wagner himself admitted that Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer had little in common. On republication in 1869, Das Judentum was scorned in the press. But even if the press were really owned by Jews, as the paranoid Wagner believed and alleged, his views caused audiences to hiss in protest at the first performances of Die Meistersinger, suggesting that anti-Semitism was far less ubiquitous in those days than we imagine. It is said that even paranoics have enemies. Unlike the racist bigot, some of whose friends are black, or the homophobic politician, some of whose best friends are gay, many of the anti-Semitic Wagner's closest friends actually were Jews. Indeed, at times he always seemed to be surrounded by Jews, not only as admirers, but as musicians and colleagues. By the time of his death, 4 Jews counted amongst his closest friends, including Hermann Levi, who was an Orthodox Jew, and son of a rabbi, whom Wagner called dearest friend, and who conducted Parsifal. And I think we see another shot of Levi there. Levi, who called himself a wandering anachronism, held Wagner in adulation and was asked to be a pallbearer at the composer's funeral. On the eve of Wagner's death, Levi himself had fallen ill and received a visit from the master. On leaving, Wagner kissed Levi repeatedly, which greatly affected them both. 24 hours later, Wagner died in Cosima's arms of a heart attack. Were his tears at parting from Levi for the last time, knowing this, those of remorse at one who had sensed his impending death and knew he had no time to disavow his utterance against the Jews? There's a picture of them all sitting around. Is it Rubinstein? No, someone else. And we want to yet another Jewish composer. The Jewish composer Gustav Mahler, who was in his 20s by the time of Wagner's death, was likewise influenced by Richard Wagner during his student days, a fine conductor thereof too, and later became a leading interpreter of Wagner's operas. Significantly, neither Mahler nor Schoenberg, who was also Jewish, held Wagner's anti-Semitism against him. Indeed, Mahler quotes Parsifal at the end of his Third Symphony. It appears unlikely that Wagner intended Parsifal to connote purity of race. During a month-long visit to Wahnfried, the home of the Wagners, by the Aryan supremacist Arthur de Gobineau, whom I mentioned earlier, he and Wagner argued heatedly, with Wagner outright rejecting Gobineau's racist ideology in favour of a Christian redemption for all. Here again we have the redemptiveness permeating the works. Whatever kind of unpleasant person Wagner may have been in real life, that doesn't seem to have sullied his art. The claim that Parsifal was Wagner's tug of the forelock to white supremacy was ultimately proven a fiction by the publication of Cosima's diary recounting this dispute. And if anyone would have been wanting it to be racial purity, it would have been Cosima. Cosima was herself rabidly anti-Semitic. Indeed, her anti-Semitism was so vituperative as it was obsessive. And hardly a chapter of her diary or her letters goes by without scapegoating Jews for this or that trivia, such as the rotting of food in the army. Oh, it's the Jews. The weather. Oh, it's the Jews. Badly tuned instrument. Oh, the Jews. It was tuned by a German, the Jews, to blame. She even turned Lenin into a Jew because she disapproved of him. Of the 400 days in which anti-Semitic comments appear in her diaries, 177 occur in the first 9 years. But in the next 5 years, there are 220 such days with comments, over double the frequency. Yet when an 1880 petition to curtail Jewish influence attracted over 220,000 signatures, Richard Wagner refused to sign it. Wagner never refused the help or advice of anyone, let alone Jews, nor did he vouchsafe anyone their due, especially Jews. Yet, looking through the looking glass of the intervening 1.5 centuries, it seems almost incomprehensible that any Jew with an ounce of self-respect would walk within spitting distance of a man who so slandered Jewish culture, religion, art, dialect, and stereotypical physical appearance of the day. I don't know how stereotypical that is, but Wagner never refused. Wagner's public utterances, therefore, seem completely at odds with his private friendships and collegial associations with Jews. In fact, there is a touching story in his book, Mein Leben, recounting his friendship with Bertolt Auerbach, the best-known German Jewish writer of the 19th century, after Heine, when Auerbach and Wagner first met in Dresden in 1846. Auerbach looks quite harmless. There he is, nevertheless. And this is what Wagner said about Auerbach. At this time, Dresden seemed to be becoming ever more and more the rendezvous for the lights of our literary and artistic world. Auerbach also reconciled himself to taking up his quarters in this city, and for quite a long time lived with his friend Hillier, who thus again had a celebrity at his side of equal standing to himself. The short, sturdy Jewish peasant boy, as he was placed to represent himself to be, made a very agreeable impression. The time being, I perceived no real affectation in Auerbach. He had assimilated so much of the time, tone, and ways of the people, and had done this so happily that in any case, one could not help asking oneself why, with these delightful qualities, he should move with such tremendous ease in spheres that seemed absolutely antagonistic. What especially attracted me to him was the fact that he was the first Jew I ever met with whom I could discuss Judaism with absolute freedom. He even seemed particularly desirous of removing in his agreeable manner all prejudice on the score, And it was really touching to hear him speak of his boyhood and declare that he was perhaps the only German who had read Klopstock's Messiah all the way through. Having one day become absorbed in this work, which he had read secretly in his cottage home, he had played the truant from school, and when he finally arrived too late at the schoolhouse, his teacher angrily exclaimed, "You confounded Jew boy, where have you been? Lending money again?" Such experiences had only made him feel pensive and melancholy, but not for the coarseness of his tormentors. These were traits in his character which drew me very strongly to him. As time went on, however, it seemed to me a curious and serious matter that he could not get away from the atmosphere of those ideas, for I began to feel that the universe contained no other problem for him than the elucidation of the Jewish question. One day, therefore, I protested as good-naturedly and as confidentially as I could, and advised him to let the whole matter of Judaism drop, as it were. After all, there were many other standpoints from which the world might be criticised. Strange to say, he thereupon not only lost his ingenuousness, but also fell to whining in a most ecstatic fashion, which did not seem to be very genuine, and assured me there was so much Judaism which needed his whole sympathy. When several years afterwards I saw him again in Zurich, I observed that his appearance had unfortunately changed in a manner quite disconcerting. He looked really extraordinarily common and dirty. His former refreshing liveliness had turned into the usual Jewish restlessness, and it was easy to see that all he said was uttered as if he regretted that his words could not be turned to a better account in the newspaper article. During his time in Dresden, however, Auerbach's warm agreement with my artistic projects really did me good, even though it may have been only from his anti-Semitic and Schwabian standpoint. Yet in his Oxford journal, Paul Lawrence writes, Auerbach, for this part, came to regard Wagner as the epitome of the barbarous Jew hatred which emerged in German public life in the 1870s to afflict the last decade of his own life. Saddened and angered by the rise of Wagnerian antisemitism, Auerbach fell into an intellectual paralysis and showed himself powerless to react publicly to Wagner's rantings. More than once, he considered writing a rejoinder to Wagner, and yet when he finally did, he failed to publish it. It's now available, you can read it. In his impotent fascination with the Meister, Auerbach suffered from a syndrome common to others of the Wagnerian circle of Jewish friends, and perhaps also of a wider segment of the Jewish cultured society of the Second Empire. With the Franco-Prussian, at this point, maybe it's a good idea to break, do you think?
Yes, that'd be fair if that's convenient.
Yeah. The next part, we start looking at movies, and I think it's not quite, it's slightly more than halfway, so the movies will take up time.
Yeah.
So would that be a good time to break?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I hope you won't leave. Yes, thank you. I'll forget the whole thing.
Yes.
One time. Thank you very much. Thank you for hanging about. Get cracking. I understand we need to get it by 9:30, so I might tailor the rest of this because there's some things I'd like to show you in terms of footage. Okay. With the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, orchestrated by Bismarck to draw the Western German states into an alliance with the North German Confederation, the unification of Germany was complete with Prussia and Bavaria. There's a young chap up there. Russian Jews didn't have full civil equality until their emancipation in 1869, when, under Bismarck's pen, on the unification of the German states, they became fully fledged Germans of Jewish faith. Thousands had already had the privilege of dying in the Franco-Prussian War, and tens of thousands more Jews would perish as soldiers in the First World War. What ought to have been liberating for German Jews, however, proved over time to have been disastrous because of later events that were to make the Holocaust of the Jews, in my view, practically an inevitability. Soon after German unification, a census was carried out in Dresden to measure not only the size of the population, but also the demographic weighting of its minorities and their occupations. Unusually detailed for its time, this particular census provides valuable insight into the foundational events that were to help enable the Holocaust. The census revealed that 10% of Dresden's Jewish population, were Jews, 10 times the national average for Prussia. And so one might assume this would apply more or less uniformly across occupations, such that one might expect 10% of builders to be Jews, 10% of accountants, 10% of unemployed, 10% of criminals, and so on. Yet 3 cases in point depart remarkably from what even standard deviation might allow. When it came to university enrolments, not 10%, but 30% were by Jews, and of the medical profession, nearly half were Jewish. Sarah Gordon, in her book Hitler, Germans and the Jewish Question, provides some interesting statistics. That Jews were overrepresented in business, commerce, and public and private service. These characteristics were already evident in the Middle Ages and appeared in the census data as early as 1843. Jews were also influential in the joint stock corporations, the stock market, the insurance industry, legal and economic consulting firms. Before the First World War, for example, Jews occupied 13% of directorships of joint stock corporations and 24% of supervisory positions within these corporations. During 1904, they comprised 27% of all lawyers, 10% of all apprentice lawyers, 5% of court clerks, 4% of magistrates, and up to 30% of all higher ranks of the judiciary. Jews were also overrepresented amongst university professors and students between 1870 and 1933. For example, in 1909 to 10, almost 12% of instructors at German universities were Jews. In 1905 to 6, Jewish students comprised 25% of the law and medical student body. The percentage of Jewish doctors was also quite high, especially in large cities, where they sometimes were a majority. In Berlin, in 1890, 25% of all children attending grammar school were Jewish. Jewish influence was thus no idle matter, and has led me to express fears about Jews taking over. It is worth unpicking this fear. In fact, it happened that Hitler's family physician, Dr. Edward Bloch, was himself an assimilated Austrian. It's Australian Jew, yeah. Much to his surprise. And here is the young Bloch. Everyone's young in this universe. There he is in his clinic. As a matter of side interest, Dr. Bloch first came into contact with the Hitler family when he treated Adolf's father shortly before his death in 1903. If the future Führer was innately crazy, there's no evidence of it in the doctor's memoirs. According to Bloch, young Adolf was quiet, well-mannered, and neatly dressed. He had patiently waited in the waiting room until it was his turn. Then, like every teenage boy, made a bow. Every teenage boy made a bow, okay, and thanked the doctor politely. Things were different those days. His eyes, which he inherited from his mother, were large, melancholy, and thoughtful. To a large extent, this boy lived within himself. What dreams he dreamed, I do not know. Within 4 years, in 1907, Bloch diagnosed Hitler's mother with breast cancer. The young Adolf was devastated. Upon her death, Dr. Bloch refused to charge them for house calls and extra medications. A few days after the funeral, Adolf and his sisters came to visit the doctor at his office in Linz. Bloch wrote, "Adolf stepped forward and took my hand. Looking into my eyes, he said, 'I shall be grateful to you forever.' That was all. Then he bowed." Early in Hitler's memoir, Mein Kampf, he wrote that at first he could himself not understand or condone the pervasive antisemitism in Vienna, but events that were to follow showed just how short-lived gratitude to one's Jewish family doctor can sometimes be. The professional jealousy of Wagner's anti-Semitism is strikingly similar in its origins to that of Adolf Hitler, but there is much to indicate he would never have approved of Hitler or the Third Reich, nor the fawning manner of his children and their descendants towards Uncle Wolf, the Wagner's family's affectionate nickname for Adolf Hitler, or his frequent visits to Weinfried, the imposing Valhalla-like mansion built for Richard Wagner's family. In Wagner's defense, he acknowledged the supremacy of Jewish intellectuals, counted Jews among his closest friends and colleagues, and wrote criticisms of Christianity every bit as harsh as those he penned about Judaism. He was almost as contemptuous of Jesuits as he was of Jews. That said, he still tried to persuade Jews to convert to Christianity. Moreover, after lunching with his friend, the concert pianist Rubinstein, pictured there, Joseph Rubinstein, not Anton, nor Arthur, lots of Rubinsteins who played the piano, who had previously played through the third act of Goethe's Dämmerung, Wagner wrote in 1878 that the Catholics call themselves higher than we, this is in writing to Rubinstein, than we, the Protestants, then the Jews are the highest rank because they are the oldest. 4 months afterwards, Wagner told Cosima, If I were ever again to write about the Jews, I should say I have nothing against them. It is just that they descended upon us Germans too soon to absorb them. Wagner acknowledged the fact that the Jews had become professionals in the distasteful business of handling money because of an iniquitous system that Germany had itself designed and bungled. It was the Germans who needed to go in for soul-searching. Yet, if Jewish overachievement was evident in census statistics, it certainly wasn't acknowledged in Wagner's odious epistle on Jewishness and music, dismissing Jews in general and Jewish musicians in particular as gimcrack and fraudulent, accusing them of coldness, non-involvement, consummate uncreativeness, stability run to seed, flashy brilliance without substance, as he alleged in the case of Felix Mendelssohn. In his observations upon Meyerbeer, he says, a musical artist of this race whose fame in our time, not naming Meyerbeer, has spread everywhere, writes his works to suit that portion of the public whose musical taste has been so vitiated by those only desiring to make capital out of art. The opera-going public has for a long time omitted to demand from the dramatic art that which one has a right to look for from it. Brian McGee writes in his short 1968 volume, Aspects of Wagner, Wagner attributed all that was meretricious in popular opera to the Jewishness of its composers by denigrating their works as a series of effects without causes. McGee also writes, I sometimes think there are two Wagners in our culture, almost unrecognizably different from one another. The Wagner possessed by those who know his work, and the Wagner imagined by those who know him only by name and reputation. McGee also goes on to write in some depth on Jewish achievement, not just in music, but in science and psychoanalysis. It gives the lie to the bulk of Wagner's pamphleteering nonsense. This is an extract from the book. In the last 100 years, 3 people have produced theories about man. This is writing in 1968, by the way, so it's a bit dated. About man and his environment, which in depth, originality and scope are equal to almost any before them. Marx, Freud, and Einstein. The theories are not compatible, but each is a cognitive, creative achievement of the highest order, and their influence has been immense. All 3 were Jews, and pioneered a Jewish Renaissance of fantastic proportions. Jewish philosophers since Marx include Bergson, Husserl, Wittgenstein, Popper, and in modern times Noam Chomsky. Not only Freud, but most of the famous psychoanalysts have been Jews. In the sciences, not only Einstein, but Nobel Prize winners. So numerous it would be tedious to list them, since the Nobel Prize began in 1901 has been awarded to 150 Jews. All this is doubly amazing when one remembers that the total number of Jews in the world is only about 18 million. In no field has their contribution been more outstanding than in music. Mahler was Jewish, as was Schoenberg and most of his famous pupils. Some of the greatest instrumentalists of the 20th century have been Jews. Kreisler, Schnabel among the dead, and one considers the living. The best violinists have nearly all been Jews, oddly among not from Russia. Heifetz, Menuhin, Stern, Milstein, Zuckerman, Perelman, Oistrakh. Jewish pianists include Gilels, Shurkin, Rubinstein, Solomon, Horowitz, Ashkenazi, Baumann, Axe and Barrowman, and the list goes on. And the conductors, Schulte, Bernstein, Ormandy, Dorati, Levine, Previn, Mehta, and Mazel. These lists themselves, grossly incomplete, cannot be matched by the 99% of the population who are not Jews. If anyone wants to say this is coincidence, my answer is it's simply not credible. The intellectual and artistic output of Jews in this century, relative to their numbers, is a phenomenon of which no parallel in history exists since Athens, 5 centuries before Christ. It is something that calls for an explanation. Why has there been this amazing harvest of achievement? Is it that Jews are specially gifted in some innate way, effectively just reformulating the ancient doctrine of the chosen people? In terms of genetics, there is no evidence for its truth. German and American racists have tried very hard to produce scientific evidence for this kind of difference between races and always failed. Jews of all people ought by now to be prejudiced against master race theories. Nevertheless, the belief by people of any race that they are inherently superior is beneath respect. Most Jews, I am sure, do not believe it. The explanation most commonly offered is that it's the cultural distinction of modern Jewry is due to their unique religious and intellectual tradition, but what this implies is the opposite of the truth. For it is mostly Jews who have escaped from the religious tradition who have achieved greatness. Spinoza, Heine, Marx, Disraeli, Freud, Kahler, Einstein, Trotsky, Kafka, Wittgenstein, Schoenberg, who nevertheless returns to the faith in repudiation of Nazism. So it seems rather that freedom from the most tribal observance ridden and past-oriented of religions is a precondition of true and deep originality. The paranoia of Jews taking over could scarcely be justifiable unless they were not good at what they do, and if the public did not support them. Yet, voting with their feet by the million, the general public flocked to performances by all of the above mentioned. And the Jewish Bernie Sanders even looks close to taking the White House. Not by taking over, but by the same democratic means that got him into the Senate in the first place. Considering Sanders wants to take on Wall Street, this too gives the lie to the prejudice against perceived Jewish control of money. Why would he want to demolish Wall Street? If there's any benefit of the doubt, then might this have been what Wagner really was trying to articulate in Das Rudimente music? If so, he didn't accomplish anything particularly edifying with his digressive hate speech, and if it was allegiance to Jewish tribal traditions that he saw as their incubus, then he was doing his Jewish friends no favours at all by trying to cajole them into Christianity, an ideology no less tribal and no less authoritarian than its parent religion, which is Judaism. Ferdinand Prager rises to Wagner's defence in the chapter Judaism and Music from his self-promoting work Wagner as I Knew Him, published in 1892. But it's clear from his 40-year friendship with the master that he had bought the whole Wagner t-shirt, hook, line and leitmotif. And thus he rationalises Wagner's entire anti-Semitic thesis. In their anxiousness to assimilate and to be as fulsome as possible contributors to the new Germany following the granting to them of full citizenship, the newly emancipated Jews can only have been entirely unaware of where this might all lead within 6 decades through the ascendancy of Adolf Hitler to the German chancellorship. The foundation of Israel was predicated on the belief that there was not a country in the world that can be trusted not to persecute Jews. Even in ancient times, Jews were pilloried by the Greeks for believing in only one God. It seems they can't win. But what was it that so turned the German people against their harmlessly prosperous new Jewish neighbours, such that they could stomach genocide? Let us return now to the final, most lethal aspect of the Dresden census I mentioned before, usury. We've already seen the potential for jealousy to be caused by the overachievement of Germany's Jews, with 3 times the national rate of university enrolment, 5 times the average representation in the medical profession. When it came to usury, the Dresden census noted that 100% of moneylenders were Jews. How could that be? Was this a genetic trait of Jews? By no means, as this was nothing more than the fact that because of a curious statute forbidding Christians from being moneylenders, only Armenians and Jews were permitted by law to lend money. In isolation, that might not appear a problem. However, in a time of recession, Jewish moneylenders would be legally entitled to call in their loans, without fully comprehending the hatred this would eventually inflame, alongside Jews' powerlessness to defend themselves as a minuscule minority. There was no 14th Amendment like that of the USA to protect Germany's tiny and vulnerable, overachieving and money-lending Jewish population. To overachievement and legislatively forced control of money can be added the final nail in the 6 million coffins of Germany's hapless Jews. The Vatican-sponsored j'accuse that the Jews killed Christ. Never mind that Christ himself was a Jew, and that none of Germany's present-day Jews took a personal hand in bringing about the execution of Christianity's saviour. It was just another excuse to foment hatreds. And contemporary German society progressively lapped it up until it was no longer challenged or even safe to challenge. It would take just one more trigger, the arrival of the charismatic and garrulously eloquent bully Adolf Hitler, to ignite a national hatred of Jews that would ultimately bring down the curtain on their so recently won citizenship and slice nearly a half of their demographic footprint. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who was at first one of Wagner's closest devotees, but was present in the Wagner's residence and wasn't present in the Wagner residence in Tribschen in Switzerland on the morning of his only son Siegfried was born to Cosima. Nietzsche had suffered since his early childhood from severe migraine, and at 44 had a mental breakdown ending in a dementia with total physical dependence due to stroke. Wagner subsequently embarrassed Nietzsche by attributing his illness in 1877 to the then young man's apparently excessive masturbation, but did send him as a gift a copy of Parsifal. in 1878. Fearing the contents of his irreligious Human All Too Human might offend Wagner, Nietzsche subsequently offered to release it under a pseudonym. However, Nietzsche's publisher could not be talked into it and was more than happy to court a bit of scandal to assist sales. Nietzsche was posthumously able to retaliate whilst editing Wagner's autobiography by suggesting Wagner himself might have Jewish ancestry. Indeed, for the first 14 years of his life, following his father Karl Wagner's death, Richard was known as Wilhelm Richard Geyer due to his mother's remarriage to actor and playwright Ludwig Geyer in 1814. His son Siegfried was said to resemble Geyer more closely than his putative paternal grandfather. Only DNA evidence can now resolve paternity once and for all, since there is no evidence Geyer was Jewish or that Richard was his biological son. Nietzsche eventually turned against Wagner, asking rhetorically, is Wagner a man at all? Is he rather not a disease? Everything he touches, he makes sick. He has made music sick. Nietzsche's final work, The Case of Wagner, diagnoses his former hero as a neurosis, decadent, a toxin for sick nerves. When it was pointed out to him in 1881 that Jesus himself was a Jew, Wagner scoffed, likening it to calling Mozart a credit to the people of Salzburg. Yet Brenner writes that Wagner's complex and paradoxical anti-Semitism cannot even remotely be understood in the abstract. It must be seen against the background of the whole man. Did Wagner sully his art with his invective against Jews as a culture? Robert Donington, in his book Wagner's Ring and its Symbols, states, in the ring, money is the root of all evil, not only in its simplistic form of acquisitiveness and materialism, but in that it drives out love. Albrecht is a stereotype of the Jew who appropriates currency. In a similar vein, Robert Gutman writes that the hunched back and wheedling vocal mannerisms of a character like Mime in The Ring are supposed to represent coded portraits of a conniving Jew, and a monologue about German art and demonizing is taken to be a racist screed and disguise, a Beckmesser. Daniel Barenboim's argument, on the other hand, is that it is not even possible for politics to corrupt art. Albrecht has been widely described, most notably by the Theodor Adorno and Wagner, Nietzsche and Hitler, as a negative Jewish stereotype with his race evinced through distorted music and muttering speech befitting Wagner's prejudice. Other critics, however, disagree with his assessment, since a flawed character could be from any race and still exhibit stereotypical characteristics. The word Jew appears nowhere in any Wagner's operas, and no character, with one exception already mentioned, is in any concrete way represented as Jewish. Moreover, unlike Shakespeare's Shylock, there's nothing from Wagner himself suggesting he intended this for The Ring. Actually, Albrecht is a composite character, mostly based on Albrecht from the Nibelungenlied, but also on Andvari from Norse mythology. Even if Albrecht were a stereotype of a Jew, one thing he shares with Shylock, and perhaps with Judas, in Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical Jesus Christ Superstar, is that although all villains, all three are sympathetic characters. The dramaturgical device of casting a villain with some good qualities paves the way for redemption, compassion, and amelioration of prejudice. The issue of anti-Semitism went on to divide future generations of the Wagner clan, and this is laid out in some detail by the historian Jonathan Cohen in his book of the same name, The Wagner Clan. Look at this. It's a great read, and it's a great second read, even better than the first read. Oh, damn. Oh, that's right. Gosh, pressed the wrong button, it still came out right. Cosima was Richard's second wife after Minna Plana, and Richard was Cosima's second husband after Hans von Bülow. Accordingly, the Wagner's 5 children thereafter included 2 stepchildren from Cosima's former husband, who were Blandine and Daniela, and 3 of their own, Isolde, born out of wedlock, Eva, and finally Siegfried. Here's the Wagner babies. I might enlarge that a little bit. This is and if you look at the Wagner genealogy, I don't know if that's visible. You look at that, you think, well, maybe it bears some resemblance to this. Oh, how do I do this? All right. That's Siegfried again. Despite being bisexual, Siegfried Wagner, at age 44, finally settled down with his ardently anti-Semitic 18-year-old English bride, Winifred Williams. No relation.
That's what she said.
In 1921, Siegfried, however, was still saying that Jews were welcome at Bayreuth. So how much of his children's fawning endorsement of Hitler and the Nazis could in part be simply down to the imperative of preserving Richard's legacy at all costs? When one of the siblings, Friedlander, broke ranks, however, it became apparent how much her private education in the United Kingdom had opened her eyes, not only to the goings-on at Weinfried, but also to those in the Third Reich. To the dismay of her mother, and probably her extended family alongside, Friedland immigrated to London after several visits, where, in her own words, she put herself at the disposal of the English government, which considered her of unique propaganda value. That's not sure that's really true. There she is with Toscanini, lovely hat. After war broke out, Winifred made a trip to an agreed neutral meeting place at Zurich in Switzerland in a final push to persuade her wayward daughter to return to the Reich so as to avoid causing it further harm. However, the lady was not for turning. Meanwhile, Hitler continued to make Bayreuth his second home, often insisting his military attend performances with him, to the considerable annoyances of some who were not fans, and snored loudly through most of the shows in varying degrees of intoxication. There's Hitler addressing the throng. There is an interesting paper, thanks to Dale, entitled Nazi Cinema in Wagner, which mentions two films, Triumph of the Will by Riefenstahl, commissioned by Hitler himself, and Stukas, with both films featuring scores by Herbert Windt, a key figure in the appropriation of Wagner by the Third Reich. Here's a Nazi propaganda movie, and listen to the musical score.
Noch die alte Apathie.
Ach, muss hier raus aus dem Lazarett, in eine andere Umgebung. Muss mal ein neues, großes Erlebnis haben. Ach, ich glaube, sollte doch die Reise nach Bayreuth mitmachen, Herr Geheimrat.
Bayreuth? Ich habe seinem Freund von Ihrem Plan erzählt und der hat hell aufgelacht.
Und warum?
Weil der gute Wilde für ernste Musik überhaupt keinen Sinn haben soll.
Trotzdem, Herr Geheimrat, schicken Sie ihn mit. Es gibt keinen Menschen, der von dort ohne Ergriffenheit weggehen kann.
Also meinetwegen, Schwester Ursula. Nehmen Sie ihn mit nach Bayreuth.
Ja.
Sind Sie mit Ihrem Patienten zufrieden, Schwester Ursel?
Was tue ich aber auch alles für Sie? Ist es nicht herrlich, unser deutsches Land?
Ja, verdammt schön. Was ist denn da, Schwester?
Das Signal zum Anfang. Wir müssen gehen.
Das kenne ich, Schwester. Das kenne ich sogar.
Waren Sie denn schon mal da?
Ach, Schwester, wenn Sie wüssten, wo ich das schon gehört habe.
Na, nicht so stürmisch.
get the idea. Wagner cures all ills, contrary to Nietzsche's assertion to the contrary. So, actually, there's another film. I apologise for this not being in English. This is actually on BBC 4. You might have seen it already.
Bayreuth, die weltberühmte Weihestätte für die Opern Richard Wagners. Jedes Jahr versammelt sich hier dessen Gefolgschaft, um dem Komponisten und seinen Werken zu huldigen. Die Geschichte der Festspiele war wechselvoll, was hinter den Kulissen geschah, blieb allzu oft im Dunkeln. Vor allem die Rolle der Familie Wagner beim Aufstieg Adolf Hitlers und ihr Bündnis mit dem Nationalsozialismus blieben unklar. Denn die Erben lassen nur ungern Einblicke zu. Der Historikerin Brigitte Hamann ist es gelungen, tiefer in die Vergangenheit der Festspiele vorzudringen. Hamann hat für ihre Biografie Winifred Wagners viele unveröffentlichte Dokumente ausgewertet und kann mit so mancher Legende aufräumen.
Kanaille nicht mit uns gemeint hat.
Ähnliches war zuvor nur dem Filmemacher Hans-Jürgen Süberberg gelungen, dem Winifred Wagner 1975 ein langes Interview gab. Der Film wurde zum Skandal.
Ich habe ja nie was Abstoßendes von ihm erlebt. Das ist ja das Merkwürdige. Nicht? Sie hatte diese österreichische, absolute, also Herzenstakt und Wärme und also ich habe nie, also ich kannte ihn doch immerhin, also von 23 bis 45, das sind 22 Jahre, nicht? Ich habe in den 22 Jahren nie eine menschliche Enttäuschung an ihm erlebt.
Seit Richard Wagner 1876 in Bayreuth die ersten Festspiele eröffnete, ist das Festspielhaus auf dem grünen Hügel Mittelpunkt der Wagnerwelt. Nach dem Tod des Komponisten wird auch die Villa Wahnfried zur Pilgerstätte. Wegen der völkischen und antisemitischen Ansichten Wagners ist Bayreuth auch rasch zur Hauptstadt der rechten Bewegung geworden, wo, Zitat, das Deutschtum in seiner wahrsten Gestalt auftritt und diesen radikalen Geist des Wagnerschen Denkens sucht seine Familie unverändert zu bewahren.
Der Wagner-Clan bestand natürlich aus dem gesamten Umfeld des Meisters. Also an der Spitze die Meisterin, Cosima Wagner, sehr ehrwürdig, die ja schon sehr krank war und seit 1906 ja auch die Festspielleitung bereits zurückgelegt hatte. Dann gab es vor allem deren Töchter. Da war also die Eva Chamberlain, eine Tochter Richard Wagners, die mit Orson Stewart Chamberlain verheiratet war, dem Rassetheoretiker und Rasseschriftsteller. Es gab dann die Daniela Tode, die bei den Festspielen die Funktion hatte, die Kostüme und auch teilweise bei der Regie zu helfen. Vor allem gab es natürlich den Sohn des Meisters, Siegfried Wagner. Damals war er schon weit über 40 und unverheiratet noch. Das heißt, das ganze Haus Wagner war zwar altehrwürdig, aber es war überhaupt keine Aussicht auf ein Enkelkind des Meisters. Das heißt, auf eine Nachfolge der Herrschaft im Hause Wahnfried.
Der homosexuelle Siegfried, der sich erfolglos als Dirigent und Komponist versucht, denkt gar nicht daran zu heiraten. Schließlich fügt er sich aber doch der Familienraison. 1914 kommt Winifred Williams mit ihrem Adoptivvater Karl Klintworth nach Bayreuth. Das englische Waisenkind war von dem entfernten Verwandten in Berlin aufgenommen und im Geist Richard Wagners erzogen worden. Der Wagner-Clan erkennt in der 17-jährigen Winifred sofort die ideale Frau für Siegfried, jung, mittellos und der Wagnerschen Musik treu ergeben.
So, yeah, you can speak German, but you probably heard you mention Stuart Chamberlain. And basically there's an apology, not apology, a refusal to apologize for the association with Hitler. even there's a book out now which said that she hid and protected Jews. It would be interesting to read that. This is a Stuart Chamberlain that was referred to during the 5 years after the death of Richard Wagner. Cosima chanced to meet theologian, historian, literary critic, and notorious anti-Semite Houston Stuart Chamberlain. Although their first encounter centred around his becoming a much-needed publicist for the Festspielhaus, a romantic dialogue soon blossomed between Cosima and Stuart Chamberlain, with Cosima's eloquent responses to Chamberlain's epistles being typed by her stenographer daughter, Eva. Cosima was Chamberlain's elder by 18 years, and eventually concluded it was better for the Wagner empire if she retained the mystique of being Richard Wagner's widow. This left the way open for Eva to step in and become Chamberlain's bride, thus allowing him to import the full venom of his anti-Semitism and devotion to the Third Reich fair and square, like Hunding's tree, into the Wagner's living room, if not also their bedroom. The Wagner that he too was previously married fitted him perhaps even more expeditiously into the Wagner family tradition of second marriages. After helping Cosima review and edit Mein Leben, Chamberlain completed his own 560-page sanitized biography of Richard Wagner to the recorded approval of Cosima. Chamberlain then set about writing his magnum opus, The Foundations of the 19th Century, a grandiose, self-important work full of fictional rant about races in general and the supremacy of Aryans in particular against the Jews, whose very existence he propounded as being against the very laws of nature. It was no coincidence that Nietzsche's noble concept of the superior man called Übermensch soon found its ignoble counterpoint in the Nazis' Untermenschen, a flotsam of Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, political dissidents, the disabled and the mentally ill, extirpated in their millions from German homes. Notwithstanding that Chamberlain's effortlessly bloated and best-selling work couldn't stand up to scrutiny, it was petrol on the fire of Nazi propaganda, even drawing the problematic praise of US President Theodore Roosevelt. You're probably aware that Henry Ford was a notorious anti-Semite supporter of Hitler's regime. After a while, when Chamberlain had started to become too big for his boots, relations with Cosima cooled. After so much public identification with the Hitler regime, the Wagner children's commitment to the Third Reich made Bayreuth a target for Allied bombers, who scored a direct hit and partially destroyed Wahnfried. There's one example. That's what used to be the living room at Wahnfried, and there's another view of the same deed. And but the Festspielhaus was undamaged. There it is today. And now, of course, it's been restored. Wahnfried has been restored. And that's the front entrance. That was okay, that didn't get bombed. It's beautifully manicured, isn't it? In 1942, however, German military and public alike were still flocking to performances of Wagner's music. There is much to observe in this contemporary performance of the overture to Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg, conducted by Furtwängler. I think we've got time to watch this. Oh, there's more. Okay, that's the interior of Wahnfried. It's quite stunning, isn't it? YouTube. So 1942, oh yes, I mentioned it, was said that the same music you've been just listening to accompanied Jews on their way to gas chambers. However, evidence of survivors points to it having been snippets of Lohengrin light music such as Strauss waltzes, soupe overtures, operetta arias, marches and the like that prevailed at camp concerts and blared from loudspeakers. Jews in Wagner's Germany were a recently emancipated immigrant class attempting to rationalize and negotiate with an irrational antisemitism fueled by overachievement, forced specialization in finance, and religious scapegoating. Over ensuing decades, Wagner would, I believe, have voluntarily recanted his monstrous treatise against Jews, just as he refused to sign the petition against them, or to countenance Gobineau's vision of an Aryan master race. His later writings on the subject were already prescient on that matter. He was also unaware of the phenomenal blooming of Jewish composers like Gustav Mahler, who himself remained a lifelong devotee and conductor of the master. Jewish conductors the likes of Georg Solti, Daniel Barenboim, Asher Fish and James Levine continued to revere the opus of Richard Wagner. There's a new film, well new, it's in 2013. This is a trailer for it. It's called Wagner's Jews.
כל עוד שאני אחיה ואני אשמש בתפקידים ציבוריים, אני אדאג לזה שווגנר לא ינוגן במדינת ישראל, האופרות שלו גם כן לא יהיו.
Hired the orchestra. There are people from all over who are flying in especially for this historic event. So plans are going according to plans, and we're going to have, I'm sure, a beautiful event on the 18th of June.
I saw it coming. I was afraid that that's going to happen, and so I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed because we put a lot of work into this.
The head of the Wagner Association.
I just mentioned Asher Fish was the conductor who conducted the version I first saw in Adelaide.
Association hired our largest hall here in Tel Aviv University, and when the university found out that this is for the performance of Wagner and got letters from survivors, then it was cancelled.
You cannot ignore it that he was declared an anti-Semite. For Hitler and his friends, he really symbolized the ideal of anti-Jewishness and anti-Semitism.
Richard Wagner hat einmal gesagt, der Jude ist der plastische Dämon des Verfalls der Menschheit. Und diese Bilder bestätigen die Richtigkeit seines Ausspruchs.
Richard Wagner, composer, musical giant, anti-Semite. To some, a Wagner society in the Jewish state may seem strange, but in fact, the story of Jews supporting Wagner dates back to Wagner himself.
There were always Jews around him. The Jews in Germany were some of the greatest admirers and backers of Wagner.
He was already accused of being part Jewish himself because he had so many Jewish friends. They used to call him the Rabbi of Bayreuth.
Copying, coaching, conducting, and they all did it for nothing, of course.
Psychologically, he needs Jews around to feel better, to feel superior to them.
For us to look back and say, how could German Jews embrace Wagner? Well, they embraced Wagner. It was great music. And it was a theatrical experience which was better than 3D and Avatar. It was more thrilling than the latest video game. Do I not buy the video game because it's made by an anti-Semitic manufacturer?
Neumann. Wagner's 19th century anti-Semitism was as obnoxious to many Germans then as it is to us today. Yet I dare to imagine that a man who trusted a Jewish conductor to direct his beloved Parsifal, albeit under sufferance, who wrote the affectionate memoir about his meeting with Auerbach, notwithstanding what followed, who revered Jews, including Julius Schweber, Joseph Rubinstein, Bertolt Auerbach, Heinrich Porges, Karl Teissig, Hermann Levi, as close personal friends alongside intellectual leaders who revered him in return and continue to do so posthumously to this day. The man who refused to sign the petition against Jewish control of their own affairs would never seek to have an entire race of people exterminated in the Nazi genocide of the concentration camps. That is not the vision of his art, and it isn't any part of the vision of Tannhauser, Parsifal, Lohengrin, Tristan und Isolde, Die Meistersingers von Nuremberg, nor Der Ring des Nibelungen. If Jewish performers and conductors and all who suffered the most terribly under the Third Reich can forgive Wagner, then I too am prepared to say, absolvo te.
I think we've got time for a couple of questions. Is there any?
Hope I can answer them.
Oh, I'm sure you're more than able to do that, Derek.
I say an observation that I think you said at one point that there were no overtly Jewish characters in Wagner's work. There is, however, in Meistersinger, King David, who is the patron figure of the Nuremberg Guild of Meistersinger, and he is portrayed very prominently on the banner which is carried before them, and he also has his own banner musical theme. You may think King David's is a bit above some of these chaps, but definitely Jewish.
Yes, that's never thought of that. You've got me on a research bend now. The next week's going to be all about King David.
Yes.
And Saul.
Bum, 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 bum. That's King David's theme, or the banner theme.
Right. Well, they said that Beckmesser was supposedly a stereotype.
Oh, but they were looking at caricatures.
The Nazis used the banner procession in the Nuremberg rallies. That's where they got it from as Master Singers of Nuremberg. You know, they go with the swastika banners.
Oh, yeah.
That's
from Master Singers. That's where they got it from, the idea.
I saw that in Sydney Opera House, and it was huge. They had the brass on the stage. It was just overwhelming. Massive thing.
Yes, it can be if they,
if you have everyone there.
Yes, yes. Well, Derek, that has been quite fascinating. Anti-Semitism is, of course, something which haunts Wagner. And I think, as you said, the problem is it's not so much what Wagner thought and believed as what people think he believed. Or a quote I was reading just recently, what he must have believed. And this, unfortunately, is very much stoked, firstly, by Cosima and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who certainly corrupted what he was trying to say. And then, of course, its ultimate appropriation by the Nazis. You mentioned Hermann Levy. He gave the Nazis terrible problems because, as everyone will know, in the 20s and 30s, it was normal to perform opera in one's native language. And Levy had produced the definitive performing translations of many Italian operas, including Marriage of Figaro, Così fan tutte, and Don Giovanni. So that caused them great problems. But there was a lot of, as well as the overall structure, lots of things. I didn't know that Wittgenstein and Heidegger were born in the same year as Wagner, probably because I hadn't bothered to look. And I didn't know that Wittgenstein was in his class. But I think really it's, I don't know if this is ever going to go away completely. Katharina Wagner professed she was going to throw open the doors to the Wagner archive. But of course what she said was the Wagner archive in Bayreuth, and Winifred's archive is not in Bayreuth. It's, I can't remember where, but it's somewhere in Switzerland. So I don't know if this is ever going to go away, but we will certainly go away with a lot of thought, a lot of thought-provoking ideas. So thank you very much indeed, Derek. Thank you.